So there was one non-negotiable, as we saw in chapter 4, as the Jesus movement moved from being uh, uh, Jewish Christian based, as it moved into the Hellenistic world. The one non-negotiable was it had to remain monotheistic. These new Christians, it didn't have to be this way, right? These new Christians could have simply added their God to the Roman pantheon of gods. But because Jesus came out of a Jewish background, his Jewishness and his dedication to his Abba Father committed this new movement to monotheism, even as it became increasingly Hellenistic. Constantine, as you remember, he received this vision in 312 before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. He received this vision, by this sign conquer. You see the sign there. And in 313, he issued the famous Edict of Milan, an official resolution of religious tolerance, even prioritizing Christianity. He especially felt the potential damage that the controversy might wreak for the empire. So he called the first ecumenical council to be held in Nicaea. Nicaea, as you remember from the chapter, after the word Nike, which means victory, in 325 for the following three purposes. So this was the purpose of the Council of Nicaea: to establish and calculate the date of Easter each year, to resolve the Meletian controversy. Now, I'll just tell you about Mellitus real quick. Meletius in Egypt, he was a bishop in Egypt, was imprisoned during the prior Diocletian persecution. Meletius advocated the open practice of Christianity during the persecution, including worship, urging Christians not to go into hiding. Well, after Constantine issued this Edict of Milan, there was disagreement in the church as to who should be readmitted to the church. Meletius was a hardliner. He was concerned about the laxity of readmitting so-called lapsed Christians who had, during the persecution, denounced their faith and professed allegiance to Diocletian. So Meletius was a hardliner. There were others who said, oh, no, we understand. We are going to readmit these Christians. So Constantine wanted to settle this controversy. And of course, the final one, the biggest one, was to resolve the issue of the divinity of Christ raised by Arius. So while there had been controversies before, perhaps because it carried the extra weight now that the new Christian church was now wed to the empire, a controversy arose that threatened to thwart the very foundation of the emerging church, and therefore the empire itself. Here's an important point to remember. There was no universally agreed upon understanding of how to fit Christ into this newly emerging religion as divine without disrupting the idea of monotheism. How can Jesus be divine and still there just be one God? So what was considered to be orthodox was still being determined. Somebody had to make a decision. So the two protagonists were Arius and Athanasius. They were both from Alexandria, by the way, which highlights the importance of Alexandria as an important city in early Christianity. Arius was a distinguished priest and scholar. Athanasius was a bishop and a brilliant theologian. Again, the controversy did more than bitterly divide the Christian community. It also threatened the political stability of the Roman Empire, now that Christianity was being prioritized by Constantine. Things were in great flux. Different understandings abounded. By the way, Athanasius, for example, many of you may know this, he was exiled 5 times during his lifetime, depending on the whim of who was the emperor at the time. So according to Athanasius, God had to become human so that human beings could become divine. At the heart of Athanasius's view of Christ was the necessity of holding that the divine nature in Jesus was identical to that of the Father, that the Father and the Son had the same substance. He insisted on the need for the use of the term homoousios, of one being with the Father, to express the Son's unity with the Father. Arius believed that the Son came into being through the will of the Father, that the Son was a creature, that the Son had a beginning, that the Son wasn't eternal, that the Father and the Son were not of the same essence. In Jesus, who suffered pain and wept, the Logos, remember that from last time, became human. One strength of Arius's position was that it appeared to safeguard strict monotheism while offering an interpretation of the New Testament language of Son and Logos. The weakness of his view was that precisely because Jesus was capable of suffering as a human, it was difficult to understand how he could be fully divine and therefore effect the redemption of all humankind. How could Jesus be the Savior if he wasn't divine? So that was what Athanasius asked of Arius. The Son Arius offered was homoousios with the Father, of a similar substance. Homoousios, homoousios, that was the argument. So Arius writes to his friend Eusebius, who we remember from last time. What do we teach? That the Son is not unbegotten, nor a part of an unbegotten entity in any way, nor from anything in existence, but that he is subsisting in will and intention before time and before the ages, full God, the only begotten, unchangeable. Before he was begotten, created, defined, or established, he did not exist. Unbegotten. We're persecuted because we've said the Son has a beginning. We're persecuted because of that and for saying he came from non-being. You know the rest. So this is all in flux in the early church. So where Arius proposed that the Son was homoousian with the Father, Athanasius held firm that the Son was homoousian with the Father. And so it could be said that the controversy was over an iota, right? A little I here in the middle. At Nicaea, Athanasius and his supporters prevailed. Homoousios was accepted to everyone except for Arius and two Libyan bishops. This made Arius's position not only heresy, but sedition. So Constantine exiled him to modern Albania. Illyria, it was called at the time. Constantine's friend and Arian sympathizer, Eusebius, and others were also exiled. Eusebius was exiled to Gaul, modern France. But in 328, Constantine reversed his opinion and had Eusebius reinstated. He brought Arius out of exile too, but before Arius could be reinstated as a priest, he died under suspicious circumstances. Arianism regained momentum, but by the Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 381, when the full Nicene Creed was ratified, it became officially heresy. So the Nicene Creed, as many of you know who came from churches that confessed it, states that Jesus is eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from God, or light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, one in being, this special term, homoousios, with the Father. So that's Arius, the Arian controversy in a nutshell, which Pelikan talked about in chapter 4. The other issue, which is just really, really fascinating, and those of you who are interested in the relationship between church and state, this Pelikan's reference to this is important. The other issue that he raises is of the temporal power of popes in the first centuries of Christianity, earthly power. Here were the issues. Two of them. If Christ sits at the right hand of God, this is what the early church people are saying. If he's the King of Kings, Pantocrator, ruler of the world, then what's the nature of that power? Is it a spiritual power having to do with individual salvation? Or does it also include temporal, earthly power having to do with the creation, execution, and prosecution of law, of the military and political might? What's the nature of Christ's power on earth? And the second one, if it is a full, not only spiritual power, but also temporal, earthly power, then how and through whom does Christ, the King of Kings, wield such earthly power? Well, once Constantine made Christianity first among equals among the religions of the empire, the first question was answered. However, the second question proved controversial, and the source of vying for power between the emperor and the popes and the bishops in the West and the patriarchs in the East. So the emperor and the church leaders kept vying for power with each other, earthly power. This is from the Edict of Milan, where Constantine and Licinius give preference to Christianity. They don't establish it as the state church yet, but they give it preference. Also, in the first century, in the first centuries, a number of cities vied for leadership of the growing Jesus movement, especially Jerusalem, where James, the brother of Jesus, was the leader, and of course, where Jesus died. Antioch, after Barnabas brought Saul and they taught there for a year, it's where the disciples were first called Christians. And Rome, where both Paul and Peter died, followed shortly thereafter in the 2nd and 3rd centuries by Alexandria, Carthage, Damascus, Ethiopia, and others. Two quick tangents here. The early Jesus movement was known as a sect, as a separatist group, and they were called by various names. So you can see them here: Christians, the Way, and Nazarenes. And second, the word church, from the Greek word ekklesia, means to be called out. Now, this is an interesting word. We know this, right? Ek, out. Ekklesia from kaleo, meaning to be called. But it's a word that was already in use in Greek society. It was used by a group of citizens for themselves who were conscious of their privileged status over against aliens and slaves, called together for a common purpose. So the early Christians saw themselves as privileged too, called out of the society by Jesus for a special purpose. The term was used by Paul to describe the Christians in Thessalonica, Corinth, Galatia, and in Philemon. In the 2nd century, Rome's primacy became universally acknowledged. The bishops of Rome, seen as successors to Peter, who was martyred there, were accepted as first among equals. By the end of the 2nd century, Tertullian wrote, Rome, from which there comes the very authority of the apostles himself, and Irenaeus, right, with the Church of Rome, because of its superior origins, all the churches must agree it is in her that the faithful everywhere have maintained the apostolic tradition. So even though all these cities were vying for authority, Rome took primacy of place. And add to that, Rome was the capital of the empire, and so it was a natural center for the growing church. Now, this is a real little known guy from history, but it was he played an important part. It's one of the most consequential but little known developments, and it took place during the brief pontificate of Miltiades. Notice the dates. He was pope when Constantine proclaimed the Edict of Milan in 312, which we read before. And in 313, before he was no longer pope, he held a council in Rome at the request of Constantine in the Pope's palace church, the Lateran Palace, which condemned a particular, well, it made Donatism a heresy at the time. And I'll tell you about Donatism in right now. Donatists believed that clergy had to live pure lives for their prayers and for the administration of the sacraments to be valid. So that's a separate story, the Donatists, but it's interesting that that Constantine would come to the Pope and ask him, really urge him, or really order him to hold a council to condemn and make this particular ideology a heresy. From that moment on, there was a link between the Pope and the temporal powers, meaning the emperor. And there are immediate signs of this change. In 325, Constantine consolidated power by defeating Licinius, the emperor of the Eastern Empire, and he took over the whole empire, east and west, moving the capital of the empire to the rebuilt ancient Greek city of Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople, Constantine's polis, Constantine's city. And now Constantine he retained the title Pontifex Maximus. Pontifex Maximus. Think about it. Pontiff. He saw himself now as emperor, not only of the Roman Empire, but of Roman religion. Pontifex Maximus. And so he called the first religious council of Nicaea in 325. Most of us in church, when we studied church history, never questioned the fact that the emperor would call the Council of Nicaea. But think about what that means in terms of who wields both spiritual and earthly power in these power dynamics in these first days. It was a short-lived unity. The empire split again into east and west. Now, look at the chart here. In the east, civil power had controlled the church, and the Patriarch of Constantinople, the capital, wielded the power. In the west, the bishops of Rome were able to consolidate the influence and power they already possessed. By the 370s, the empire had three rulers, each a co-Augustus: Valentinian, Gratian in the west, Theodosius in the east. Valentinian ruled part of Italy and Greece and North Africa. Well, by 380, February 27th of 380, these three co-Augustuses, these three emperors, issued the famous Edict of Thessalonica that established Nicene Christianity as the empire's state religion. So Constantine in 313, in the Edict of Toleration, issued this tolerance of Christianity and even made it the first among equals. But it wasn't until 380 when it became the state religion. And here's part of that Edict of Thessalonica, and I'll just let you read it. This is when, in 380, Christianity becomes Christendom. Really, it becomes wedded to empire. And notice these Nicene Christians are called Catholic Christians. So in the East, the patriarchs had spiritual authority, but the final authority, because of Constantinople, right? Constantine, or the emperors, had the primacy. In the West, because it was the center of where the Pope had authority, it was papal primacy. That was what was established there. So I'm gonna wrap this up with just a few quick points now. So after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Pope was the source of authority. But for 3 centuries afterwards, the Eastern Roman Emperor still maintained authority over the church. In the West, the Pope had authority over the church and the empire. In the East, the Roman Emperor maintained authority over the church. In the East, the Pope still had to receive approval from the emperor to appoint bishops and priests, and even over church governance. In the West, Pope Leo I the Great, they call him the Great, he was a pope from 440 to 461, systematized papal primacy based in Roman legal principles for succession. And the emperor, Valentinian, acknowledged him not only as a spiritual authority, but the juridical authority. The emperor, during this period of time, for 30 years, between 425 and 455, acknowledged the earthly power of the Pope. He writes, Valentinian does, nothing is to be done against or without the authority of the Roman Church. This is in the 5th century. Well, with the collapse of the imperial authority, the authority of the emperor in the Western Empire, as the Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns were on the doorstep of Europe. In fact, Pope Leo negotiated with Attila the Hun in 452 not to not attack Rome. So that's one of the reasons why Leo is called the Great. Leo placed the papacy in a position to take the lead in earthly affairs, so that the great Fourth Council, the last ecumenical council in 451, the Council of Chalcedon, they're able to say St. Peter has spoken through Leo. 150 years later, they faced the collapse of the empire's authority in northern Italy. St. Gregory, Pope Gregory I, Pope from 590 to 604. As the Lombards stood at the gates of Rome threatening the city, he accepted papal responsibility for the city. and took over its political administration and negotiated for its protection. One of the outcomes was that he established the independence of the Roman Church from the Byzantine Empire. So this is the Basilica of St. John the Lateran. This is the Cathedral Church of the Bishop of Rome. Not St. Peter's, St. John Lateran. And by the way, this was the church that we're going to see later on when we talk about St. Francis of Assisi. This is the one where he had a vision that he saw this turned upside down. And in the vision, Christ tells St. Francis to rebuild his church. As the Bishop of Rome, Gregory also became its political ruler. That's what's important about Gregory. He takes charge as Pope, not only of spiritual power, but also political power. And so he sends missionaries throughout Europe, not only with the message of the gospel, but also political authority of Rome over the empire again. Rome, mother and head. So from the late 6th to the late 8th century, there was a turning of the papacy to the west and an escape from the subordination to the authority of the Byzantine emperors of Constantinople. A real split between east and west. When Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, Charles I, right, as Roman emperor on Christmas Day, 800, as Holy Roman Emperor in the Basilica of St. Peter, the congregation crowned him Augustus. He established the precedent that in Western Europe, no man would be emperor without being crowned by a pope. And finally, then, as Pelikan points out, this situation culminates in what's called the investiture controversy, the most significant conflict between church and state in medieval Europe. In the 11th and 12th centuries, a series of popes challenged the authority of the European monarchies. At issue, who could? Was it the Pope or the monarchs? Who had the authority to appoint local church officials, invest them as bishops and abbots? The conflict ended in 1122 when Emperor Henry V and Pope Calixtus II agreed on the Concord of Worms, which differentiated between royal and spiritual powers. So that's in very, very brief, in summary, what Pelikan is pointing to here about who has the power and what kind of power is it, as the church becomes more and more wedded to empire. So where would you like to jump in? There's so much in these chapters, right, that Pelikan kind of teases out. And so remember, we're church historians now. We're historians now, looking back and trying to analyze, well, what's going on in these people's heads? What's going on in their hearts? What are the issues that are at stake? What are the issues that are at stake if we're trying to analyze these periods of church history, which is really Western history? It's pretty overwhelming, I guess. Did I?
It is. Forgive me for having not participated in all these classes to even ask this, but during this period of time, are we losing some of Jesus in terms of caring for the orphan and the widow and the sick and the hungry and the imprisoned? And did that all become a faction of a role of the empire versus the believer, the follower?
You asked the question. That's your answer. I mean, you've asked it in a question form, Linda, but you're suspicious that maybe that's what's happened, right? I'll say two things about that. It's not as easy of an answer as it might appear. The answer is yes and no and yes. That's how I would answer it if a student had asked me that in the classroom. Yes, because, right, I mean, that makes sense, right? That it's now, Christianity's now become wedded to the empire. It's become a part of the elite. So it's not, it takes on kind of a less personal, more impersonal character. It's not just the simple faith, but it's an ideology, right? It becomes a political ideology as well as a faith. No, in that what we would call social welfare is now being delegated to the state, which isn't a bad thing, right? Governments now, Christians in government are petitioning the government to form, what we would call social welfare subsets within the state, right? Not just secular not what we would call charitable organizations, but that government has a role in caring for the orphan, the sick, the more marginalized. That's a positive development, right? That's not just we're going to rely on charity, right? Charitable institutions. Government has a role to care for those on the margins in the society, and Christians were at the forefront within the Roman Empire, petitioning, pushing, moving the empire to do that. But the final answer is yes, because the concerns of the empire, especially the militarization of the church, finally held sway. And so what you find then over and over and over again throughout the history of the church in the West are various reform movements. So, for example, Francis, I'll just use St. Francis as the most prominent example, but we could also use Benedict and others of the monastic movements. These monastic movements, it wasn't just that these people wanted to, go and pray by themselves and get permission by the Pope and go out into the desert, and do their spiritual thing. These were reform movements because they saw that the church was going to be too elite and forgetting Jesus' original message of caring for the poor and the sick and the orphan and the widow and caring for each other in what we would call socially responsible ways. So yes, no, but yes. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a need for these reform movements, right? By the way, it's the same thing that happens in Islam. Many of the Sufi movements in the Islamic world started out as not just spiritual movements, but social welfare movements, caring for the poor and the marginalized within the Islamic world. It was a real concern for Rumi, for example, and others. So that was a long answer, but it's not a simple answer. Go ahead, Quentin.
That original question you were talking about, Pelikan's narration, if I could sum it up, I'd sum it up in 3 words: power, power, power. And that's I know I come off sounding cynical here, but as the church became more powerful, I think that was recognized, especially by Constantine. And so he had to assimilate the church into the plans. And if you can enlarge on that, then the empires did that and adopted divinity to consolidate power, to move power. And this, I think that's what I see out of this narration. I know that's pretty broadly stroked, but I think Pelican really illustrates that clearly. And also, Michael, you're filling in those gaps from Pelican, really drew that out. And so the symbiotic relationship between church and state, is right there. And those compromises were not all bad. They were not all good.
Quentin, I don't want to dominate the conversation here, but I couldn't agree with you more. It used to be, back in the day, that Constantine was viewed as almost saint-like. He calls this Council of Nicaea, you get rid of all these heretics, and all the rest. And, they talked about Constantine's baptism at, before he dies, and, almost as this kind of great Christian. We don't know exactly the state of Constantine's heart, right? But this term that I used, Pontifex Maximus, that had been used by previous emperors, but Constantine grabs it, and this becomes part of his standards. I don't mean rules, but the military standards, that he put the Chi Rho, the Chi and the Rho meaning Christ, on these standards, but it was on his military standards. And it became a symbol of, it became a great symbol of power, not spiritual power, but military might. And he saw himself, Pontifex Maximus, that's the Pope's, that's the Pope's title, right? But he accrues this power to himself. And now we can, you continue to use the word cynical about yourself, but I know you're a good enough historian to know that this is what was done in those days, right? Emperors, the Holy Roman Emperor was viewed as a deity. Caesar, if you're Augustus, if you're just a Caesar, that's one thing. But if you're an Augustus Caesar, that's a promotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're an Augustus Caesar, you don't want to take a demotion to just being Caesar. And a number of Caesars after Constantine play this game with their councils. They want to hold on to this idea of their Augustus Caesar, because that's semi-divine. And so Constantine clings to this idea that he's not only the ruler of the state, but he holds spiritual power as well. Again, I'll just repeat what I said before. We've always kind of just taken it for granted. Oh yeah, Constantine called the Council of Nicaea. What chutzpah, right? To order the bishops to come together to settle a theological dispute. This is the emperor who does that. And the bishops all follow because it was undisputed. He had the authority to do that. And the other thing I'll say, Quentin, this is something I don't know as much about, but you would be interested. One of the things that is underreported about his term as emperor, he refines the monetary policy of the Roman Empire. He removes it from a silver and gold economy because there was great inflation at the time. And again, I don't know a lot about this. And he starts mixing the silver and gold with bronze to make some of the coins. And they say that he does that because he wants to remove from circulation a number of the silver and gold coins that were made to the Roman gods previously.
That's fascinating, Michael.
So
he went off the gold standard. 2,000 years before we went off the gold standard, and that's really interesting. I was completely unaware of that.
So as an economist, I think you would be interested in just looking at that a little bit more.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Going to fiat and that sort of thing. And the interesting thing also, is that the emperors wanted to complain, co-opt divinity, for more power. But what happened historically is that the popes took over. They are the ones that were doling out the power after it left. So, and again, it's power, and it's fascinating.
I'll be right with you, man. I just want to point out, just remember this, because this is going to plague the church up until our present day. We already see, don't we, the split between East and West, between Orthodoxy, like Greek Orthodoxy, the Orthodox churches based in Constantinople, and Rome. They're two different theological orientations, but two different political orientations. And I'll just say one more thing. We see this in our day about how the Pope is a spiritual figure in the West, but not a lot of political power. But think about, for example, the Patriarch of Moscow, or the political cachet that, for example, the patriarchs in Poland had during the communist revolution there, or the unraveling of communism with Lech Walesa and the workers' revolt, and how the patriarchs had influence. And there's right now, even within Russia, right, there's a dance that these patriarchs, Pope Shenouda and others, kind of dance with Vladimir Putin and others. So even to this very day, this vying for, who has the power and what kind of power they have. Sorry, Matt, go ahead.
No, I want to go back to Quentin's observation of power, and Linda's question to the teachings is how there's a paradigm shift here from what tiny bit of we understand from his early followers chose to put down in at least the first three gospels as priorities, as countercultural, as peasant driven, as the antithesis and the challenge of political and religious power, to taking Christology to what I believe, and that's where this is my own journey of understanding or interpretation to the upside down of Jesus. And it just was absorbed and with military might, with economic might, and with deciding who's pure and who's a heretic, and the consequences to those you label heretics. It's not quite the same as going through the historical data, but there was a mindset shift there at some point, to go from the Son of Man to the King of Kings. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around 1st century to 4th century on that aspect. I don't have any answers, but it's challenging.
Who would like to address that? I think you're on point, Matt. I mean, that's one of the central questions, isn't it? Well, can I take a crack at it?
Please, somebody help. I'm drowning. Help me.
Well, I'm going to begin the conversation. I'm not going to end it, but I'm going to begin it. And then the rest of you jump in. It's pretty understandable from a human perspective. And let me explain. And I don't mean this is not, I'm talking about it's understandable because it's in Michael's path. It's not simple, but I'm looking at my own predilections as a human being. These early Christians, we can idealize them and say, idealize the movement and say, care for the poor, the widow, the orphan, concern for each other, service in community, prayer, all of those wonderful values. What was the other thing about them? They refused to obey Caesar. They were countercultural. And so almost from the start, right, they butted heads with the powers. Which then, I mean, I'm simplifying, but which then over a period of 100, 200 years, which we've seen already in the last few weeks, brought them under persecution. Locally, regionally, throughout the empire. Who would want that? I mean, just as a human being, just in my own little world, Michael Spath, I want to be liked. I want to get along. I want to, it hurts me when people don't like me. I don't want to rub anybody the wrong way, much less the mayor. I can talk all I want about nuclear disarmament and all the rest. I have not withheld my taxes. I haven't even withheld a portion of my taxes when I'm supposed to pay them. So, how brave am I? Not very. I talk a big game, but, I'm still conforming, right? So that's part of it, right? So there's this human predilection about wanting to get along with the powers, and then of course, when the emperor not only tolerates this new religious movement but embraces it, I can imagine these people saying, "Hip hip hooray!" I mean, poor Meletius, he's saying we should have been hardliners, we should have been prophetic. John the Baptizer, why are we letting these lapsed people back in again so easy? They didn't pay a price like I did. I was in prison. So there's this human dynamic, like Michael Spath, who, oh God, thank God the powers are recognizing me. It's a temptation for all of us. It's a temptation for all of us. Of course, it comes at a great price, doesn't it? And so, Matt, people like you and me and others on the call here, and I'm sorry for going on and on, we're kind of saying to ourselves, maybe it's better if we're in our day, we need to be more like John the Baptizer and that early Christian community that's small and caring for each other and caring for, as Linda pointed out, the widow, the orphan, the others, right? The marginalized. Maybe it's not about the power anymore. But of course, that will butt us up against Caesar again. And are we ready for that? Are we ready for the price you pay to do that? That's the question, really. Are we ready to pay the price? And so you ask the question, Matt, but it's not just about them. It strikes me right in my heart when you ask it. So I went on and on, but it critiques Michael Spath, not just those early Christians, is what I want to say.
Michael,
I haven't even withheld a dime of my taxes. What's wrong with me if I really believe what I'm saying? Go ahead, Karen. Thanks.
yeah, aren't we somewhat the same place today? I mean, how are we gonna be looked upon years from now versus politics versus religion, or big religion versus small religion?
You ask a wonderful question, Karen. You're exactly right. And it's not just those on the religious right who are walking the halls of power, and who we like to rail against. For sure, they have been co-opted, right? I mean, Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, absolutely. But we too, though, we've sat back and been kind of quietistic, or we'll march with a sign out in front of the courthouse. all good things, but where's the price we're going to pay? Are we ready? Are we ready to really pick up the standard against the powers on behalf of the gospel? I'm waiting for Michael Spath to do that. I'll let you all speak for yourselves, but I'm waiting for me to walk the talk. Karen, thank you for that. And Matt, thank you for the question. Yeah. Power, power, power. Quentin's right. But of course, I'm complicit in that. And by the way, that's why people like, I'm talking about in our day now, but that's why people who are like Ibrahim Kendi and Isabel Wilkerson and people in our world who are people who are part of the critical race theory, are talking about our blind spots, our privilege. It's reminding us that it's not just that, we live in nice parts of town or have good incomes or have a couple cars in the driveway. Our privilege, much of it is unconscious. How we're benefiting from the system, right? It's not just white Christian nationalism, it's Christian capitalism. White Christian capitalism that even those of us who are progressives are complicit with. I'm on my soapbox. Why don't I just step down for a second and let the rest of you jump in here? Thank you, Karen.
Michael, I guess power, 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 and this is when women were really left out. Is that correct?
It had been
Or
leading.
totally brushed to the side.
You didn't hear any of these. None of the people I mentioned were women, were they?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, I look at privilege. Everybody. I look at it very differently in that it's always been white male privilege, and and I look at the privilege that I have received is really only a matter of circumstance and timing. That had I been born 100 years ago or 200 years ago, things have been very different. From a perspective of, I just look and think a lot about how just a few years of difference would have made for, because I'm an only child and my mom was divorced when I was 5. And I think of her success and what she was able to achieve is really, I guess people could look at it as privilege, but I always kind of looked at it as circumstance. That thank God that I was born in a time where people began to value a woman's thought process. Otherwise, my mom and I don't know how we would have survived as a divorced woman, as a woman who began to have a career my mom is successful, but we started out very poor. No. So anyway.
Well, Tony, you make a good point. The question is how do you, given the circumstances in which you were born and raised, and thank God, how do you minimize your blind spots and stand in solidarity with those who haven't had the same kinds of privileges without being part of a white savior kind of a mentality? How do you enter into solidarity with others? The first step, oh my God, I violate this all the time, but the first step for me is humble listening and learning. And chances are I'm not going to like what I hear. Mm-hmm. But rather than reacting defensively, then even more humble listening. and
Right.
learn.
But that also, I think, has to come on both sides too.
Well, Tony, except for that, I mean, I don't disagree, but except for that, those who have privileges,
Mhm.
it's easy for Michael Spath to say the person, I don't want to, characterize certain parts. I don't want to have to tell my African American friend who's been struggling, for years to establish a certain level of income, whose ancestors may have been blacklisted or redlined or whatever. I don't want to have to say to them, you need to listen to me too in this dialogue, because we come from unequal places. It's incumbent upon me, full stop, to listen. There may come a point, I'm not disagreeing, there will come a point when it's time for us to engage in dialogue. But for now, it's incumbent upon me to listen and to learn. I guess that's would be my gentle and loving response to you.
You created an image of that in my mind a year or so ago, Michael, when one day in class you said, I need to be sitting at the kiddie table and listening. And we all participate in that hated kiddie table at Thanksgiving and Christmas, where it was always too low and too far away from the heat of the conversation, and nobody was listening to you. But I really have been asking myself, wherever it is I find myself in a situation where this matters, to say, are you sitting at the kiddie table and just shutting the hell up, rather than thinking you have some answer? Because I don't. And I do think it makes me more humble, and I do think it makes me able to learn more.
Linda, you make me think of one of the ways that we're able to do that. And of course, COVID makes that harder to do, but we need to go to those places where we're going to be able to hear those voices. So our bodies need to move, and we can read, we can listen to, podcasts, and, that's all important. But somehow the presence, right? Somehow we need to be in spaces, in places, shoulder to shoulder with the people, so that it's not, so we're in the same place. So we're in the same context, in the same space, right? Where we can learn bodily, kinesthetically, not just in our heads. So I appreciate that very much, Linda.
I'm involved in CASA right now. What an opportunity this is giving me, I'm interacting with a family that involves four teenage daughters. And Linda Kerr knows how to fix the whole damn mess. There's a whole bunch of people going to jail. There's going to be a whole bunch of people getting charged for crimes against children. There's going to be 4 kids marched into a school building every single solitary day, and there's going to be tutors, and there's going to be cars that run, and there's going to be grandparents that become literate, and on and on and on and on. There's going to be people that come in and actually kill bugs in the house, and yet that isn't what I'm called to do. I'm called to just hear all that and somehow then sit and cipher the critical pieces. For me as a nurse, it's always airway, breathing, circulation. Okay, get yourself back to the things that are absolutely critical, matters of life and death for 4 teenage girls. In another home, it's a newborn baby. And then carry that message back to the court. Are we fixing anything? I don't know, but we're fixing me. We're helping me here. There's a myriad, 1,000 million gajillion things that have gone wrong in these lives, and in the lives of these same people I want to put in prison, for God's sake. I mean, they are as broken and beaten and as their kids. But I think until you sit in, until you hear it, I need to be really careful about how I judge it.
Yeah.
And how I fix it.
Thanks for that.
this conversation is reminding me of my introduction to Cliff Kindy, who some of you know from North Manchester Christian peacemaking teams. And I first met Cliff Christmas Eve when he walked, this was 2001, Christmas Eve, he walked from North Manchester across to Ohio and visited mosques. And he spent Christmas Eve at Beacon Heights in Fort Wayne. And then Christmas morning, I joined him and went down to the Chute Street Mosque. And I just observed how Cliff interacted. He was going from city to city to listen to what the Muslims in the communities were experiencing, and to be there as a Christian representative who cared, which at that time, Muslim communities all over the country were under duress because of what had happened 9/11 and the disappearing of Muslims by the security forces of the United States. So anyway, listening, being there, and living one's faith and purpose. Cliff represented all of that for me.
Well, it still does, right, Terry? I mean, you've remained kind of in touch over the years, a great model in our community. Gang, let's put our historian's hat back on again. Do you get what was at stake for each side in the Council of Nicaea? I'm not saying you have to agree or disagree, but just as historians looking back, do we understand what each side had at stake? Athanasius and Arius. Did that little doctrinal kerfuffle that changed the history of Christianity really? I mean, most of us are Arians, right? I mean, I'm looking at mostly Arians on this screen here, I think, or at least a subset of Arians, so you're all kind of heterodox in some way. But do you understand what was at stake, at least for the early church? Again, not if you agree or disagree. For Arius, it was monotheism, right? I mean, he's trying to safeguard monotheism. You get this Jesus comes along. How dare you call him God? You already have a God, right? And for Athanasius, how could Jesus be the savior if he's not God? So the whole question in these first 300, 400 years is, how do you fit Jesus into this monotheistic understanding that we've had, without just getting rid of the whole ball of wax? Go ahead, Matt.
But as soon as you say the word savior, it goes back to me to the Old Testament of the scapegoat. And I still don't think, and maybe I'm just stubborn as hell, I don't think that's what I see in the Gospels of the early writers is a scapegoat.
Here's where, well, remember, here's where, although I am a real big fan of Paul, here's where he really shapes the early Christian theology. Remember that we've got the historical Jesus, who we know very little about. I'll just read, I know you know this. Oral tradition for 25 years. And then Paul. So Paul's writing before these pictures that we have in the Gospels. And so in some ways, and of course, you find 4 different pictures of Jesus in the Gospels. Yeah, I mean, understood. Paul's Jewishness, really comes to the fore, right, in terms of these salvation paradigms. Yeah. No question.
Well, the other Pauline quote is that from Romans, what is it, Romans 13, that gives authority to the state over, that God has authorized this. So that's another Pauline, and I think Romans is one that is attributed to Paul as one of his original writings. So anyway, that's,
And Terry, it's so important that you brought that up, because when we get to the time of the Reformation, Romans is central to Luther's understanding, Romans and Galatians. And Lutherans traditionally, so Luther and Calvin. Calvin wants to establish a state church in Geneva. I mean, he sees, that's why even today the Reformed churches have embraced liberation theology like nobody's business. The Lutheran churches, much more quietistic politically, because Luther, with his doctrine of the two kingdoms, thinks that, well, churches have a responsibility for the soul. The political rulers have responsibility for the world. Now, I'm oversimplifying, but Lutherans have never quite liked to mix those two. Calvinists, like the UCC, like Presbyterians, like the rest of the Protestant churches, no, it's about establishing the kingdom of God here and now, not only after we die. So this distinction between Lutheranism and Calvinism in the Protestant Reformation, Terry, you point that out in their various reactions to Romans 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Lutherans always have been much more quietistic. One of the reasons why I was so uncomfortable in the Lutheran Church, especially given my training in liberation theology, and why the United Church of Christ was I felt much more at home. Anybody else? We still have a couple more minutes.
Michael, your last comment about Lutherans was an insight on extended family relations for me, as I have a brother-in-law who grew up and is still active in the Lutheran faith, and what you just outlined for me helps explain anytime I have a discussion with him on what it is on faith. Thank you. That was more than worth the price of admission.
well, and it makes me remember Bonhoeffer's writings, especially his letters from prison, that what he referred to often as the German evangelical church, Lutheranism in Germany, and its acquiescence to the Third Reich and its participation in, really, and veneration of all the above. I mean, so somehow Lutheranism, especially the Missouri Synod, sorry, Mike, Missouri folk, relatives that I had, their churches always had flags up on the chancel, and not that my Methodist church didn't, but the Lutherans were much more wedded to nationalism, I guess.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Eugene, you popped in. Do you want to say something?
Yes, it was funny. The other day I was in the grocery store and I met a couple of guys. What triggered it all was I heard them oversay something about AMC. And if anybody knows what's going on in the stock market, that's what they were talking about. And I do this all the time about engagement. I engage them in conversation. Come to find out, both of them were students out here at the Lutheran seminary. And one of them was Black, and one of them was from St. Louis, I believe. And the other one was from Madagascar, which I found interesting. And, that they had that reach that far. So, but I thought I'd put that in there.
Thanks, Eugene. Next week, we talk a little bit more about Logos Christos. By the way, is this, do we want to continue, or how is this class going for y'all? I mean, I don't want to subject you to Michael Spath, you know, if, okay, well, as long as we're feeling like it's worthwhile, we're trying to raise issues, you know, from 1600 years ago and throughout church history. But really, it's about Western culture too, right? I mean, the church, the Christian movement, especially now that it's become Christendom. By the way, that's an interesting conversation in and of itself, isn't it? What happens not just not just what happens to Christianity when it becomes Christendom, what happens to the faith, but what happens to the Western world when the Western world becomes Christendom. Right? And if you think about it, when the popes had authority, we didn't talk about this today, when the popes had authority, think about that, what that authority meant. If they hold the keys of the kingdom, you know, Peter, you know, I am Peter, is what the Pope says, tu es Petrus. That means you hold the salvation of this human being's soul in your hands. I'm thinking back now, 1700 years ago, right? If you hold the emperor's soul in your hands, who's got the power? Really, you know what I mean? Who has the power? If that's the understanding in the world in that day. You know, we don't think in those terms today, right? As Protestants or as humanists or all the rest. But if we go back into that time, you know, that ain't nothing, like my dad would say, right? That ain't nothing.
Yeah, you could excommunicate an emperor or king.
I mean, it's everything, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, when Charlemagne is crowned on Christmas Day by Pope Leo III, that tells you something. Even then, and we're talking now 500 years later, right? 800, Christmas Day 800. Now that's a complicated time, because immediately after the Pope does that, he gets down and bows to Charlemagne. But there's a whole lot of political intrigue going on in that time. I didn't want to get into it when I was talking. But this vying back and forth, we come back to Quentin's opening. Power, power, power. Who wields it? You know, because really in these times, we're not talking about just power. We're talking about the power of Christ who's sitting at the right hand of God. That's their understanding, right? That's their understanding. And it gets played out through the history of Western culture until our own time. Well, thanks, everybody.